on the morning of my 64th birthday. The sound that defined the day wasn't laughter or clinking glasses. It was the buzz of my phone, steady and insistent, like an angry hornet circling my ear. By noon, I was suddenly the most popular woman in Connecticut. All it had taken was destroying my family's expectations and making one decision they never saw coming. At 10:47 a.m., my son Brian received a bank alert. $3.2 million had left my account, securing a waterfront villa overlooking Long Island Sound. By the time he called, the deed was already in my name. 3 days earlier, when March 15th arrived, I had stayed silent. For years, I had reminded Brian and his wife Sarah that my birthday was coming. I had dropped hints, sent messages, even attempted guilt trips. But every year, the day slipped past me like an afterthought. Always there was Patricia Wells, Sarah's mother, whose own birthday fell conveniently just 3 days before mine. Patricia's sudden ailments, mysterious falls, and timely health scares always managed to draw my son away. For the past 5 years, I had smiled through excuses while he chose another woman's emergencies over his own mother's birthday. That morning, instead of reminding anyone, I watched them load their car for a weekend getaway to Vermont. I waved goodbye from my porch, then immediately picked up the phone and called my real estate agent, Jennifer. "Find me something extraordinary," I told her. "Money is no object." She thought I was joking. But when she opened the doors to a villa with marble floors, a gourmet kitchen, and sweeping ocean views, I knew instantly it was mine. By Wednesday afternoon, the ink was dry. By Thursday morning, I was posting photos on social media, the gleaming kitchen where I set out champagne and takeout, the deck where I ate my first birthday dinner alone but not lonely, the master suite with a fireplace waiting to be lit. My caption was simple. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones you give yourself. And that was when the calls began. Brian's number appeared first. Exactly 5 minutes after his bank alert, I let it ring. Then Sarah called. Then Patricia herself, by 2 in the afternoon. I had over a dozen missed calls and a string of messages ranging from concern to outrage. My favorite came from Sarah. "This isn't like you. Please call us so we know you're okay. Not like me." The phrase made me smile. For years, they had grown comfortable with a version of me that bent, that adjusted, that stayed quiet so others could be comfortable, that Margaret was gone. What none of them knew was that I could afford every penny of the villa and more. For months, I had been living with a secret they never suspected, an inheritance of over $7 million from my Aunt Helen, the quiet, unmarried woman in Boston whom they barely remembered. I was the only one who had visited her, the only one who held her hand at the end. She left everything to me, her brownstone, her jewelry, her carefully built investment portfolio. I had been silent about it, watching how my family treated me when they assumed I had nothing. What I saw made me realize the truth I had been erased in my own family's story. When Brian finally confronted me, his words spilled out in panic. "Mom, you can't afford this. You should have consulted us first. This isn't you." I stood at my new windows, watching a sailboat glide across the water, and said, "Who says it wasn't planned? Who says I can't afford it?" His disbelief was almost comical. He had been monitoring my account since his father's death, telling himself it was to protect me, when in truth he had been treating me like a fragile widow incapable of decisions. He never once imagined there was more money than the life insurance, more independence than he could control. That evening, unpacking boxes of old photo albums and my mother's quilt, I felt a rare peace. For once, my home reflected me, not the role they assigned me. The phone kept ringing. but I poured myself another glass of wine and turned the sound off. Tomorrow would bring arguments and accusations, but that night belonged to me. In the following days, their concern morphed into pressure. My sister Linda called, echoing Patricia's opinion that I might be having a midlife crisis. My nephew Michael insisted the purchase didn't fit my practical, conservative nature, again and again. The refrain came, this wasn't like me. They could not accept that maybe they had misunderstood who I was all along. When Sarah finally called from Vermont, her voice trembled with rehearsed worry. Patricia thinks this might be cognitive decline, she said, carefully choosing her words. I laughed out loud. Or maybe, I told her. I finally decided to live my own life, but beneath their objections, a darker truth simmered. Every March, as my birthday was sacrificed to Patricia's ailments, I had suspected something petty and manipulative. What I discovered instead was far more sinister. Digging through old papers, I found documents that revealed Brian's debts, tens of thousands in credit cards, late mortgage payments, even loans taken in my name with forged signatures. My son, my careful, responsible Brian, had been sinking for years, and at the center of it all was Patricia. The coincidences snapped into place every health crisis, every rush trip to Vermont, every postponed celebration had aligned with Brian's financial collapses. Patricia's illnesses were not distractions, they were cover stories. I called my lawyer, Marcus Reed, and within hours we uncovered the truth. Brian had been siphoning money into Patricia's schemes, convinced he was funding experimental treatments for her mysterious ailments. In reality, Patricia was no helpless grandmother. She was a career con artist with a record in 3 states. But the greatest betrayal was still to come. Patricia wasn't working alone. She had a partner, someone younger, someone inside the family, and slowly, painfully, the pieces began to point towards Sarah, my daughter-in-law. The pieces shifted from suspicion to certainty the night my security system pinged at 11:30 p.m. A car idled at the bottom of my drive with its headlights off, and a slender figure walked along the hedge line toward my deck, pausing at the sliding door as if she expected it to yield. Even from the dark of my living room, I could recognize the tilt of her shoulders. Sarah tried the handle, made a call I could not hear, then stood very still with her back to the glass, fingers pressed to her forehead like a figure in a painting of worry. After 10 agitated minutes, she returned to the car and drove away. It felt like an answer I hadn't wanted. The person positioned closest to my son was also the person positioned closest to our secrets. At 9 a.m. the next morning, I asked Marcus to run a background check under her maiden name. By noon, he called back with a voice that had softened into the tone he used to deliver bad news. The professional history she'd presented to Brian Financial Services, a prestigious degree, a spotless resume was largely invented. More alarming, her past overlapped with Patricia's arrests for insurance and elder fraud. Margaret, Marcus said quietly, there is a Sarah Warren born in 1985, with the same description, associated with Patricia Warren in public records from North Carolina. I think your daughter-in-law is Patricia's daughter. The room lifted and lowered like a deck on rough water. The story of how Sarah met Brian at a conference began to look less like fate and more like logistics. I drove to Brian's house at 2 p.m., rehearsing sentences that wouldn't crush him. He answered with eyes ringed in sleepless gray and led me to the kitchen where the afternoon sun fell over a stack of shopping receipts and a childless bowl of fruit. Before I could speak, he slid a manila folder across the table, the same honey color as the one I had found in your father's desk. I found these in her dresser, he said, voice thin. Inside were photographs taken with methodical care our cars, The deeds to my old home, scans of my late husband's ledgers, snapshots of me holding a wine glass on various patios with times and dates scrawled in the margins. Interleaved were bank statements showing regular transfers to accounts with the name Patricia in the beneficiary line, and a letter in Sarah's neat hands that made my breath knot, Mom. The Thompson situation is working better than we planned. The inheritance is larger than we estimated. Accelerate the timeline. He read it as if willing the verbs to change tense. When he finished, his shoulders sagged, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. At 3:30 p.m., he tried to defend what could not be defended. He talked about kindness and pressure and love, then faltered over the word love as if it suddenly no longer fit. I told him what Marcus had found, the overlaps, the paper ghosts that lined up too perfectly to ignore. He pressed his palms over his eyes. "She's not who I married," he said, the sentence collapsing mid-air. I reached across the table the way I had when he was 8 and grieving a baseball loss, as if it foretold the rest of his life. "You loved with an open hand," I said. "That is not a flaw." It was Detective Lisa Rodriguez who turned our grief into action. At 5 p.m., after I left a report with the State Police Financial Crimes Unit, she sat at my villa and sorted the evidence into a narrative stronger than shock. The forged second mortgage with my counterfeit signature, the credit cards opened in my name, the personal loan using my Social Security number, the sum that bled from bad decisions to criminal intent, roughly $180,000, spread across instruments designed to disappear. She asked calm, exact questions. And when I didn't know, she filled the silence with tasks. Freeze this account now. Print those statements tonight. Save the metadata on each photo. The only moment her composure slipped was when my bank manager called at 6:15 p.m. to report that the previous afternoon, someone had attempted to transfer $2.3 million out of my investment account with forged power of attorney papers. "They're accelerating," the manager said. "We blocked it, but it was sophisticated." Detective Rodriguez's pen stilled. "They think the window is closing," she murmured, "which means they'll run or they'll push." The push came dressed as an apology. At 7:40 p.m., Sarah arrived alone with a tasteful gift bag and a snow globe of a Vermont inn that swirled with artificial flakes when she shook it as if to conjure innocence. She perched at the edge of my sofa, voice pitched to tremble. She worried about me. Patricia worried about me. Stress, isolation, impulsivity, gentle words braided into a rope. I set the snow globe on the side table where the falling glitter could catch the lamp. "How long have you known about Brian's debts?" I asked in a voice that surprised me with its evenness. Her face tried to keep up with a story that kept changing. Work pressures, medical bills, clinical trials. The vagueness ate its own tail. When I said identity theft, the color left her mouth, but she did not deny it. And when I said forged signatures, she stood up as if the floor had betrayed her. "You're not thinking clearly," she whispered, then fled, leaving the little winter behind to settle on its inn. By 10 p.m., Marcus had confirmed the piece my gut had already fitted. Sarah's degree was fabricated, her employment invented, her age shifted down like a dimmer switch. The records tied her to Patricia across years and states. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and stared at the ocean black as velvet, feeling very old and very awake. It was a relief and a devastation to realize my son had not been careless so much as curated, delivered into the arms of a con he mistook for family. At 9 the next morning, Detective Rodriguez proposed control where control had been slipping. We would freeze what could be frozen, notify every institution, and gather what could hold up in court. We would not warn Sarah or Patricia. We would let their certainty draw them closer to the net. if they called. We would listen. If they threatened, we would record. They want leverage, she said. Closing her notebook at 9:50 a.m., let them show us which lever they plan to pull. When the call finally came that evening, it sounded strangely cordial, as if we were acquaintances arranging lunch. Patricia's voice had the same cool, managerial cheer she'd used in my kitchen when she suggested age-appropriate housing. She didn't ask. She told, pay $3 million and call off the investigation, or my husband's reputation and my son's future would be delivered to whatever agency would do the most damage. I felt the old Margaret twitch toward appeasement, felt the urge to protect, to buy quiet. Then I touched the snow globe and watched the flakes drift and thought how long I'd been living inside someone else's weather. No, I said, and the word landed like a door that finally shut. When Patricia ended the call, the silence in my villa felt as vast as the water beyond the glass. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. The old Margaret, the one who smoothed over conflict and accepted invisibility, would have paid. She would have written the check, buried the shame, and carried the secret until it killed her. But the woman who had signed her name on a deed for $3.2 million without blinking was no longer willing to bow. I called Detective Rodriguez and repeated the threat word for word. Then it's time to set a trap, she said simply, as if we were discussing dinner plans. The trap was both straightforward and terrifying. The next evening, at 7 p.m. sharp. Patricia called again. This time I was wired, every syllable recorded. While two detectives sat in an unmarked car down the street, she laid out the instructions in that careful, patronizing tone she favored. A wire transfer, $3 million to an account she claimed was secure. In return, silence. Everyone wins, she cooed. I kept my voice steady, though sweat dampened my palms. I'm not paying you a cent, I told her. If my husband broke laws, we'll face the consequences honestly. I won't let you blackmail me another day. There was a pause, long and sharp. You'll regret this. Margaret, she hissed. I hung up before she could twist the knife. Within 48 hours, the documents Patricia had threatened to release appeared in the local newspaper's newsroom and on the desk of the Internal Revenue Service, my late husband's carefully hidden shell companies, the tax evasions he had buried under legitimate contracts. The signatures Brian had unknowingly supplied, all of it spilled into daylight. The cost was staggering. Nearly $1.8 million in back taxes and penalties, weeks of meetings with accountants and attorneys, the humiliation of seeing my husband's name questioned in print. Brian faced potential charges for documents he had signed without understanding, though his lawyer insisted his ignorance would shield him from prison. For the first time in years, we spoke with raw honesty, not as mother and child circling each other's pride, but as two adults stripped bare by betrayal. I'm sorry. Mom, he said one evening as we sat on my deck with the sea air turning cool. For the loans, the signatures, the way I treated you like a child. My voice cracked when I replied. And I'm sorry for hiding your father's secrets, for letting you drown while I stood silent. We were poorer. Yes, but for the first time in years, closer. 3 months later, a call from Detective Rodriguez arrived like a tide turning. Patricia and Sarah had been found in Mexico, weaving their same web around a wealthy family in Guadalajara. The authorities arrested them before they could vanish again. Extradition followed, along with charges of wire fraud, identity theft, extortion, and conspiracy. They're looking at real time, Rodriguez said, and we recovered about $400,000 in assets. It was not the full sum, but it was enough to prove the con had cracked. Brian filed for divorce immediately. Sarah never contested. Unable to appear in court from her cell, the woman he had called his wife was revealed as Patricia's daughter, a partner in deception from the beginning. He sold the house heavy with shadows and moved into something smaller near me, a place where he could rebuild without ghosts watching from the walls. Life, I discovered, doesn't return to what it was before. Not after something like this. It reshapes. I kept the villa, not because I needed its size, but because it symbolized something larger, my refusal to live small. I traveled, took art classes, and cultivated friendships with people who knew me as Margaret. Not as Brian's mother or Robert's widow. Brian visited twice a week, sometimes more, carrying groceries or simply his company. We no longer played the roles of caretaker and dependent. We were equals, scarred but honest. On the anniversary of my move, I stood on the deck at dusk with a glass of wine and thought about what Patricia and Sarah had taught me. Despite the ruin they left behind, they showed me how kindness can be mistaken for weakness, how love can be manipulated into exploitation, and how even the people closest to us may see us as resources rather than souls. But more importantly, they forced me to learn that dignity is not given. It is claimed. It is refusing to let others define your worth, your decisions, or your place in the story. I had spent too long invisible, too long waiting for permission to exist. Now, every wave that broke against the shore reminded me I was Margaret Thompson, and I was done being small. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so more voices like mine can be heard. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know your story too.